kind of formula to using people, which means that you usually mention somehow the region or country where they're from, the material or the medium that they use, the generation they're in, or what their recent exhibitions were. I realize that in all these cases there's a kind of a curious ambiguity with Bijl. In terms of the region where he's from, he's a Scottish artist who lives in Australia but spends quite a lot of his time either in Europe or the States. In terms of his material or medium, he writes novels, he makes postcards and pens and tins and photographs, he's advertising hoardings and films and all sorts of stuff. In terms of his generation, well, I don't know, there's something about the work that seems somewhere between a kind of old-style pop artist and a 12-year-old having fun in the shed. In terms of recent exhibitions, it's difficult to work out the line between fiction and reality, or the real exhibitions and the fictional exhibitions. There's a funny part of one of the pamphlets that I've got here about him, which is a list of cities in line, which reads, for some peculiar reasons I haven't quite worked out why, Chicago, Aberdeen, Miami, Madrid, London, Melbourne, Frankfurt, Basel, Amsterdam, Hong Kong, Edinburgh, Paris, Cologne, and Los Angeles. It's kind of like suspended in the middle of this article without quite knowing whether it's an article written or exhibition, so it's kind of curious. There's something in the work, in all of the work, somehow that seems inspired by a kind of film noir intrigue, but never quite so serious. And there's something about the work when I was looking at it, just in this pamphlet, that reminded me of, I think it was Albert Hickok who said that if ever you're in doubt about the way a story is going, have a man enter the room with holding a gun. And there's something of a feeling to that with a lot of the work here. So I'm not quite sure whether the work begins or ends. So I'm as interested as you are to find out more about the work of Bijl. So could you please welcome me today?
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, thank you, Andrew, and hope you can hear me at the back okay. I've called this our sort of performance lecture. This is the lecture part of it, and the performance is me trying to get round the world from Australia and back again in 40 days without losing my slides or damaging my liver too much. But I've called this lecture True Lies and Superfictions, and it's part of the research I've been doing for a PhD by project at RMIT University in Melbourne in Australia. So the thesis itself will be an art installation, and that'll be accompanied by a 30 to 40,000 word exegesis or written component. And the PhD is part of a longer investigation that I've been making for about 15 years into what I call superfictions. So I'll start with a very brief video clip, just lasts about 2 minutes, and then I'll go into the slides after that.
Did I want this to come out? No. Was I embarrassed about it? Yes. Did I ask her to lie about it? No.
Polls confirm support for President Clinton in Lewinsky case.
The House voted to put the Star Report on the internet and soon afterward distributed the report to its members, the President and the world.
This is a very sober moment. This is the beginning of a long climb up a steep mountain. None of us look forward to it with any great joy.
The depressing details of the report included 11 grounds for impeachment, among them that the President perjured himself, obstructed justice, and abused the power of his office. Prosecutors published explicit details about 10 alleged sexual encounters Monica Lewinsky had with President Clinton, including one in the Oval Office, one involving a cigar, and another involving oral sex while he was talking with 3 members of Congress on the phone.
How would you feel? I mean, it's 435 members, and Jim Chapman and I were the 2 that he called during this alleged episode. So you have no way of knowing those things.
Investigators say there was evidence of witness tampering, attempting to have his secretary, Betty Curry, back up his false testimony if she were called as a witness. And finally, Starr claimed Clinton abused the power of his office by misleading and delaying the investigation by public denials of his sexual relations.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
Okay. Okay, so how do we know when the President of the United States is lying to us? How do we know when journalists and editors are being economical with the truth in pursuit of a good story? And how do we read visual data, including works of art? And what happens when fiction escapes from the pages of a novel and illusion slips out of the frame of a painting? These are some of the questions I'll be posing today, and they're questions I ask myself all the time. And my only answer to date is that we must become increasingly sophisticated in our interpretation of text and image. Take this image, for example. It's by the Spanish duo Juan Fontcuberto and Per Formaguero. We see a strange centaur-like creature shaking hands with someone wearing a white, narrow jacket. It's a poetic image. We know it's a fiction immediately, but it's an image that can be enjoyed for its own sake through the willing suspension of disbelief. We enter into this world created by the artist Fontcuberto and the taxidermist he employs, Formaguero. They've created the world of a fictive zoologist, Dr. Peter Ameisenhaufen, who supposedly died in a car crash in the far north of Scotland in the 1950s. One of my students tells me Ameisenhaufen means anthill in German. So using fabricated photographs, diary entries, journals and constructed animals, which Ameisenhaufen was supposed to have created, Fontcuberto spins a web-like narrative that's part visual and part text-based. The Dutch magazine Perspectief in July 1989, and 1989 will recur throughout this lecture as an important year. The magazine reported how Ameisenhaufen's assistant, Dr. Jimenez, captured a young Hermaphroditus Ottocetarius. Full-grown animals had already been previously observed, and the fact that this goat-like species of animal ate flesh was less characteristic than its sexual behavior. As a pseudo-hermaphrodite, the 8-footed, 4-eared, one-headed creature lives purely monogamously. It only makes sounds when the female half, which is constantly on heat, stimulates the lazy male half to ensure reproduction in a manner that has been described as remarkably gymnastic. But if that is the poetic fiction, then this slide is what I call the realist fiction. What are we looking at? Some kind of supermarket at first glance. But there's something about the space it's set in, the polished wooden floors, the sugar white walls, the track lighting, that makes us think something is wrong. It looks like an art gallery, but who would go to the trouble of recreating a supermarket within an art gallery? Those who know his work will immediately reply, Guillaume Bijl, the Belgian artist, and will know him to have constructed doppelgangers of laundromats, driving schools, camping equipment shops, and dry cleaning outlets in galleries, museums, and at commercial art fairs across Europe. This is what Christopher Schenker wrote about this particular installation in Flash Art in 1991. Guillaume Bijl has built a small, true-to-life supermarket in the space of the Littmann Gallery. We know it's quite a while since this artist began to work with the single, never-changing concept of introducing half-public space situations into an art context. One wonders if it's Bijl's intention once again to insist on the reality of sign systems and of the fictional quality of any other definition of the real. The supermarket as a real work of art, the review continues, is thus an imitation. Bijl places himself in the near vicinity of the nouveau realists, of whom Bruthers purportedly remarked that he didn't like their wordiness and that their objects only projected a rude and simple notion of progress into art. Mention of the name Bruthers moves me along with excitement and eagerness to my next slide, taken from the catalogue of the 1990 Sydney Biennale, The Ready-Made Boomerang, curated by René Bloch. It's of Marcel Bruthers, and from its title, A Dream with Cream, you can probably tell that he was a poet turned artist. It's one of my favorite images of the 20th century, or any century. And in her catalogue essay for that Sydney Biennale, which she called Taken in a Moment of Optical Confusion, Anne-Marie Freiberg discusses the use of film and photography by Marcel Bruthers, alongside their use by Man Ray, Marcel Duchamp, Andy Warhol, and the Canadian Michael Snow. She talks about how Bruthers investigates reality through a conceptual plan that reflects on language and on cultural production. Describing an exhibition at MTL Gallery in Brussels in 1970, she says that in Bruthers was examined the manifold overlappings of picture, object, language, and reality. He had the text of the invitation written on the gallery window. Prior to this, he had filmed the street through the window and had documented the change from day to night. During the exhibition, this film was projected directly onto the window. Bruthers' great project was for a Museum of Modern Art, department of the Eagles. And when I first learned about this, I almost gave up my own project, the Museum of Contemporary Ideas, which at that time in the mid-80s, I was just formulating. As you'll see, I continued with it and attempted to take it along different paths. But before I explore those, I just want to say a few words about photography and the old adage that photography never lies. At century's end, it would appear that mostly photography lies through its teeth, as can be seen from the morphing techniques used several years ago on the cover of Art Monthly to change Edward Heath into Harold Wilson, and so on through various British Prime Ministers to Jim Callaghan, Margaret Thatcher, and John Major. And as you'll know from the Woody Allen film Zelig, this type of fabrication is not limited to still images. But what about this image? What are we looking at here? It shows that the camera can lie by taking out as well as adding in. And it's typical of the sort of images I've been collecting as part of my research for my PhD. And it's in fact a reproduction of one of Degas' paintings of ballerinas practicing at the bar. However, because it's been printed in an Iranian school textbook, the human figures have been airbrushed out of it. And you can still just see the bar itself up in the top background. And if you look carefully, you can see that the shadows of the dancers, the ballerinas, remain on the floor. So, what I'll now do is describe the evolution of my own work. 10 years ago, around August of 1989, I created a fictional museum in New York called the Museum of Contemporary Ideas. It existed only through its press office, and rather than exhibit this work in a gallery, I sent out fictive press releases around the world to news agencies like Reuters and Associated Press, to galleries, museum directors, and to artist friends, describing the pioneering work of what was supposedly the world's biggest contemporary space for exploring art and ideas. Notionally, it was located on New York's Park Avenue, and I didn't do this as a hoax or as a way of making fun of the art world. I did it partly out of curiosity to see what would happen, and partly as a way of creating a mirror image of the art world itself, to reflect the high seriousness of the art world, which I respect, and also the absurdity that occurs when art meets money and ambition. Now, I wanted the look of the press release to be a little old and dated, and this was partly due to my changing perception of New York as a city. As a child growing up in Glasgow, I'd visualized New York as a modern city of the future, perhaps a little like the present-day Singapore, with gleaming skyscrapers competing to reach the blue skies above. When I first visited the city as an adult in 1983, which was to review an exhibition of the Scottish artist Stephen Campbell's work at Barbara Tall and John Webber's gallery for the then ArtScribe magazine, I was amazed to find myself back in what felt like the 1930s, with Art Deco skyscrapers, diners and delis that were straight out of an Edward Hopper retrospective, and steam rising from beneath the city streets. Even the Pan Am jet I arrived on had seen better days. The armrest was broken, the headphones didn't work, and the carpeting was threadbare, but I loved it all the same. So I wanted the press release to be a bit like a Last Days of Empire look to it. At the bottom of it, reversed out in black and white, is the museum's mission statement and list of staff members. Dr. Sunday Anderson is the director, Hideki Kazuhito is the professor of ideas, Ivan Vertov is the executive archivist, so it's pretty international. Sally Ann Shaw is in charge of press and media, and the education programs run by Don and Charlie Scottsdale, while the off-planet research is overseen by an ex-graffiti artist called Cindy Boltzmann, whose street tag used to be KLOGW. There are 15 additional department heads, and they can be contacted through the Department of Public Information. At the top of the press release, which you probably can't see here, there's a faint map of a city in the background, sort of in half-tone pink, with a riverside drive running across the bottom of it. And if you glance at it, you may think that it's New York, but in fact, Dundee in Scotland also has a riverside drive, and the map in the background is of Dundee with the words contemporary ideas just running across where the art school's situated in Dundee. So the main body of this press release ran to about 7 pages, and in it I tried to plan out how I'd run a huge museum and what innovations I'd make back in 1989. Over time, these press releases have become a little bit like a traditional sketchbook, a place where I can put ideas down quickly and return to them later. The device is also similar to that used by young architects who may have to wait years before they get a shot at a real commission. They can still draw up plans for buildings that they hope one day may be built. And there's plenty of books, as I'm sure you all know, available about plans for unbuilt buildings. Even the great Scottish architect Charles Ranney Mackintosh left plans and a model in the art school for an opera house, and I'll never understand why my home city of Glasgow, when they built a new opera house down the road from the art school, didn't adapt his building to their ends with state-of-the-art acoustics. So, sorry, I'll just go back to that. This first press release reflects what was happening in the art world in 1989. At that time, exhibitions such as Magicians de la Terre in Paris and Bilderstreit in Cologne were being mounted after years and years of planning. By contrast, I introduced a gallery space in the museum which would respond immediately to political and cultural events through a think tank of curators, journalists, economists, and philosophers, thus bringing the tensions of the newsroom and the pressures of the press office to the presentation of art and ideas. As the museum director, Sunday Anderson, said, the changing room aims to challenge accepted ways of curating, as was done in very different ways by Jan Hoot's Chambre d'Amis and Hubert Winter's Sculpture and Republic. And the program commences with an exhibition called To Get Rich is Glorious. This exhibition centers on propaganda and takes its title from a statement made by Deng Xiaoping in the early 80s, to get rich is glorious. By contrast, his June the 9th speech, which melded economic liberalism with political orthodoxy and made 5 days after the Tiananmen Square massacre, spoke of plain living and set out a 70-year program to promote the new philosophy. And so in various releases, I responded to everything from the fall of the Berlin Wall as it was happening to the then growing tendency for artists to work in teams, and I sprinkled real artists such as Irwin, Gilbert and George, and Jane and Louise Wilson in with groups I'd invented myself, such as Nouvelle Kunstfaction from Belgium, Art Against Astrology from London, and an East Village group called Made in Palestine. Now, the museum itself had its billionaire benefactors, Alison Abner Bucky Cameron, and this is a rare shot of Abner Bucky Cameron at his ranch in Phoenix, Arizona, There's not many images of the couple. This is the only other one I have of the billionaire oil magnates taken at the Cologne Art Fair in November of 1988. And this is just an image in black and white from one of the first press releases about the Berlin Wall, which was released about a week after the wall came down. And I've actually found the bigger museums in the world, the bigger the museum is, the more degraded the press release looks. So with these images, I put them through the photocopier several times just to degrade the black and white image. So I'll just return to some of those groups I mentioned. This is the group Art Against Astrology, with one of its installations, The Strange Attractors. And Made in Palestine, a fictional name for a fictional state, some might argue. They take photographs of members of the art world at work and at play and present them as large-scale Cibachrome photographs. This is Nicholas Logsdale at the Cologne Art Fair in, again, I think November 88 or 89. This is Ashley Bickerton and Mark Quinn relaxing at the Sydney Biennale. And this is John Armlader and Sylvie Fleury at the Venice Biennale. And in the background behind John's shoulder, you can just see Haney Armenius, the Australian artist, with his dealer Sarah Cottier. So these are all works presented by Made in Palestine. And this slide is of the Raminjining artists' burial poles, again at the Sydney Biennale in 1988. So various other exhibitions and invented artists are described in that first press release, from the invented group Film Pilgrims, whose art house movies can only be seen in single cinemas around the world, thus giving film the sense of pilgrimage that's always been associated with single masterpieces like the Mona Lisa. If you want to see that, you've got to change money, fly to Paris, go along Rue Rivoli to look at it. Film Pilgrims do the same thing with cinema, and have been for the last 15 years. And there was also a survey of the photographs of the Dutch photographer Ralph Kapper. He actually grew up in Los Angeles, but his grandparents were Dutch and owned a barber shop in Rotterdam. Kapper was a war photographer in Cambodia and never completely recovered from what he saw there. He spent most of the 70s working as a photographer in Disney World, and said that he'd seen so many children die in Southeast Asia that he wanted now to be surrounded by children being happy and having fun. The circumstances of his disappearance and his presumed suicide are still unclear. All that was found on the beach was his shoe, and this is one of the last images found in his camera. The exhibition contrasts his war images with those he took at Disneyland, plus a number like this of light entering darkened rooms, which were only discovered after his death. So, for want of a name to give to these fictive situations that I've been creating and trying to record, I've called them Superfictions. And later in the lecture, I'll come to my most recent one, which is a novel and an art installation, both of which are called The Art Fair Murders. I mention it at this point because all of the characters, museum staff, groups of artists and individuals mentioned in the first press release from 1989 are characters within the novel that I'm now writing. And these range from Alison Abner, Bucky Cameron, through to Ralph Kapper and K-Log W. Each time I create a new superfiction, I mark its arrival with the production of a new pen. And as you can see, there are pens from the Museum of Contemporary Ideas, Cameron Oil, the Art Fair Murders, and so on. Next year's superfiction will be called Rival Cities, and it'll look at historical rivalries between different cities, such as Cologne and Dusseldorf, Glasgow and Edinburgh, Sydney and Melbourne, as well as smaller rivalries, such as Suva and Nandi in Fiji, or Stromness and Kirkwall in the Orkney Islands of Scotland. And I couldn't find rival cities for London and Paris, and I suppose they are historically rivals of each other, as in a tale of two cities, because they're just both such huge cities, possibly even New York and Moscow during the early days of the Cold War. So this is a project that works at various levels, partly through the media, partly through galleries and museums, and through lectures such as this. And it also operates as a mail art or a postal project. And this slide would represent a typical mail out from either Tasmania in Australia or Edinburgh in Scotland before that, around the world, of press releases in envelopes containing pens. And the stamps on the envelopes seek to capture the childhood surprise, like the first snowflakes of winter, when an envelope drops through the letterbox from a distant land. And in many ways, I must admit that I find the complexities of the postal system and its labyrinthine reach more impressive than the internet. And because I deliberately decided that for a period between 89 and 99, I'd not make art specifically to sell in galleries, I financed my project and my travels mostly through writing for art magazines and newspapers, and also through selling pens. So if anyone's interested, at the end of the lecture, I've got a range of pens on offer, which is my sales pitch for the evening. But the pens are small artworks that can be created by phone or fax and paid for with credit card without the hand of the artist getting in the way. So at this point, I'd just like to talk about a little bit of the terminology that I use in my artwork. I've always felt that if you're going to be an artist, you should have the fun of inventing art movements and technical terms. Why leave it to journalists, critics, and advertising moguls? Look at the mess they made of such brand identification as Impressionism, Cubism, and new neurotic realism. So, Superfictions I've talked a little bit about. Splitting the 11 I'll come to in a moment. Heroic amateurism is the idea of going into a new subject at the highest level and risking falling flat on your face. Logical extremism is the tendency of art movements to move to any given logical extreme. And the bottom one, synthetic modernism. In the early 80s, I became tired of both modernism and postmodernism as ways of describing what was happening in the art world. They seemed to come head to head, a bit like football matches, and there was a positive grey area where modernism and postmodernism overlapped. And I prefer the term synthetic modernism, like a synthesis that you'd get with synthetic cubism in around 1917, 1918. So the term splitting the 11, this is a card I've produced for a book about my collected writings from 1981 to 2001. It's called Splitting the 11, Arts, Darts and Travel. And the content of it will be 1/3 Scottish, 1/3 Australian, and 1/3, I suppose, global. And along with that, the novel and the installation, The Art Fair Murders, covers roughly the same period. But I'm beginning to find the deeper I get into both projects, the better I can describe the period through fiction than I can through reality. So I think in the end, The Art Fair Murders for me will be more satisfying than the collected writings. But I'd like to say something about this image, which features a photograph of James Lee Byers at the Venice Biennale, taken by my fictional group Made in Palestine. As a young art student in the early 70s in Dundee, we used to play darts in the tavern bar, and I always remembered there was a quirky offbeat move or throw where if your score had reduced to 111, you were given one chance to win the game by splitting the legs of the number 11 at the side of the board, which you see here in the 9 o'clock position. And I use this as a metaphor for how I make art and how I write about art. That is, not always going for the treble 20 time and time again like the real professionals, but aiming for different things just for the fun of it. So I enjoy writing for in-flight magazines and daily newspapers as much as I do theoretical journals. And for me, the art is aiming at the particular editor that the piece is being sent to. And similarly, in the art I make, I like aiming it at different people, deliberately creating good art along with bad, so-called. And in many ways, first year at art school was the most enjoyable for me because we did a bit of everything: anatomy, graphics, photography, textiles, life drawing, and so on. And I'd have been quite happy not to have had to specialize at all. I think it was the late Ian Byrne who said that all artists eventually return to being first-year art students. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And it also has to do with this other term, heroic amateurism, which is at the heart of my idea of superfictions. And this is where you go into a new area with no previous experience and huge ambition and, of course, risk, as I say, falling completely flat on your face. I formulated it through meeting and observing a lot of the neo-expressionist painters in the early 80s, like Jörg Immendorf in Germany, Stephen Campbell in Scotland, Eric Fischl in North America, Sandro Chia in Italy. Many such artists came to painting from backgrounds in conceptual art, or performance art, or from formalist abstraction. It was as if, rather than being concerned with ironic postmodern quotation, what they wanted to do as conceptual artists was to take the concept painting and see what could be done with it. And so they very much learned to paint in public as heroic amateurs, and I use the term amateur in the best 19th century tradition of the word. And going on from that, in Irving Welsh's rather quaintly titled play, You'll Have Had Your Hole, he begins his introduction by saying, "It's very difficult to examine your own motivation in undertaking any piece of creative writing. In the case of my new play, however, I decided upon medium before content, electing to write a play simply because I'd never written one before. It seemed a logical step, as in logical extremism. I'd done novels, I'd done novellas, stories, songs, and poems. I'd adapted and produced original screenplays and developed Head State, a performance piece with Boiler House Theatre Company. The conventional stage play seemed the next thing to tackle. In a sense, this is the heroic amateur philosophy, but I see it extend into totally uncharted waters, so that in future superfictions, I might, for example, create a television soap opera based around an art school or a travel agency specializing in flights to the moon or Mars, or maybe a fictive advertising agency, and in so doing do a reverse Charles Saatchi. But the Museum of Contemporary Ideas was my first superfiction, and not long after the first press release was sent out, I visited the Cologne Art Fair. It was November '89, and a group of us from Scotland with Alba magazine went across to Cologne the same weekend that the Berlin Wall was coming down, 10 years ago exactly. Inside the vast trades hall where the art fair was being held, I bumped into Dr. Wolfgang Max Faust, who I knew from the days when we both wrote for Artscribe magazine. He was now publishing a magazine called Wolkenkratzer, and I asked him if he'd received one of my first press releases. I don't know who was more surprised next, him to learn that the museum was a fiction, or me to be told that he'd printed an article about it, which you see on the screen here. Beautifully translating the press release into German, describing the generosity of Abner and Alice Bucky Cameron, and the works of all the fictive artists, from Ralph Kapper through to the film Pilgrims. He liked the idea, he liked the fact that I'd done this, but he went white for a moment and said, "For God's sake, don't tell anyone here about it." He said that since publication, this has been widely discussed across Germany in the previous few weeks, and it's been promoted as the biggest new museum in the world in New York, and he had just been asked to chair a meeting of German curators and industrialists to see if Frankfurt could build a museum to rival this one in New York. So again, the notion of the hoax raises its head, but in a sense I prefer to see it as an example of how through fiction and imagination you can make things happen in reality quicker and more effectively than you can through the so-called normal bureaucratic channels. So, I'll now look at a few artists working in perhaps a similar way, and I'll start at the same art fair in Cologne in 1989, and it was here that I first met and interviewed Res Ingold, Up until that point, I'd believed myself to be pretty much a lone eccentric working alone in Edinburgh, creating fictional situations and organizations. Then a friend from Dusseldorf, Alf Lohr, had once mentioned to me about a Swiss artist called Res Ingold, who lived in Cologne and ran a fictive airline called Ingold Airlines. And when I was strolling round the art fair, I came across Torch Gallery from Amsterdam and saw what looked like an airline booth mixed in amongst all the art galleries, and I knew then that I'd found Res. And there he was, dressed in a dark business suit as Chief Executive Officer of Ingold Airlines. We immediately hit it off and discovered we'd a number of things in common, not least the fact that his business plans and my press releases were printed in black and white and red. This is a brief quote from this first business plan. "Security, competence and flexibility is the slogan of Ingold Airlines, according to its latest business plan, and with the introduction of its new Super Jumbo 747-400, Ingold Airlines is the first airline company in the world to introduce a new cabin system. From flight to flight, the equipment is chosen according to the individual needs and wishes of the passengers. These in-flight facilities include lounge, secretary, conference, fitness, cosmetics, media, playland, cargo floral, and animal service." And as you can see, Res goes to enormous lengths to get a good image. Here we see some cargo on the landing strip of the Furka Pass, located in one of the most impressive alpine landscapes. And it says it was mostly American tourists who took advantage of the Paris-Geneva Furka route with an open final destination. And Res doesn't just take airline stands at art fairs, he does the opposite and takes airline stands at airfairs as well. And I liken the two to sort of animal behaviorism. One is camouflage and the other is display. So that at art fairs, it's like display. His stand stands out from all the galleries showing artworks and sculptures, whereas at art fairs, at airfairs, it's like camouflage, and the fictional airline just sinks into the background of all the other airlines at the fair. So I'll just say at this point, my PhD research has borne most fruit through individual meetings or giving lectures like this, because there's not so much published in magazines, or certainly not books, and only a few catalogues. I've been in Amsterdam and Cologne this week trying to find early catalogues of the work of many of these artists that I'm looking at. And library and exhibition searches have only worked up to a point, so I find traveling's the best way to get the new knowledge that I'm looking for. So Res was the first artist I met creating this sort of work. A lot of the artists I've subsequently come across, I suppose the term oxymoron would describe a lot of the work. Naturally Artificial was an exhibition at the Venice Biennale 2 years ago. If I said Dutch mountains, you'd get the same sort of idea. My own Museum of Contemporary Ideas is slightly oxymoronic, with ideas and contemporary and museum coming together, or the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles. But it was Res Ingold who then introduced me to Servaas, a Dutch artist, and his wonderful world of deep-sea fishing. And I could almost separate my lecture on the work of each of these artists and do several lectures. So I'll just give you a taste of a few of them. The Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam gave Res Ingold and Servaas a double-headed show several years ago, and this is the catalogue for it. You can see Servaas on the left, dressed up in his deep-sea fisherman's gear, Res Ingold on the ship with him on the right, and up at the top, many of these artists, as I do myself, use signage and logos as artwork. So you can see the logo for Ingold Airlines up at the top right, and for Servaas World of Deep Sea Fishing up at the top left. And I've seen Servaas dressed like this behind the Torch Gallery stand at the Basel Art Fair in Switzerland. But in the early 90s, I became aware of an artist called Seymour Likely, and saw examples of his work in various art magazines, especially Flash Art from Milan. And I felt that something was wrong, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. And on one of my visits to Amsterdam, I was told that 3 Dutch artists, in fact, had invented a fictional American artist called Seymour Likely, and they were exhibiting his work around Europe. On my next visit, another friend told me they'd expanded the Seymour Likely project in all sorts of bizarre and interesting directions, and had recently persuaded a Dutch brewery to give them a bar in the center of Amsterdam between the Red Light District and the Royal Palace. I tracked them down and had a few beers with them, and this is one member of the group sitting outside the Seymour Likely Lounge, and I went there on Wednesday and checked that it still existed, and it's still running as a bar, with artworks by artist friends inside the lounge, plus work supposedly made by Seymour Likely. They also sponsored a Dutch basketball team designing their strip, and more recently they moved into films. But they only produce the film poster. They never make the actual film. It's a bit like sort of slacker art for the 1990s. But the other term, along with oxymoron, is metonym. I hate these jargonistic terms, but in a sense, the film posters are metonymic, as are the Cameron oil pens for my fictional oil company. So the small part stands for the whole, like the phrase "to sail before the mast," where the mast stands for the whole ship, or "to be behind bars," where the bars stand for the prison. So these are all sort of metonymic statements. And the complete fiction, if you like, has to be created inside the head of the spectator. In fact, the 3 characters at the bottom of the poster are the 3 Dutch artists who comprise Seymour Likely. The one at the bottom right was the one seen sitting outside the Seymour Likely Lounge. And in a sense, these fictional films inhabit a space somewhere between Cindy Sherman's project and Charlie White. And the image here is a couple of Charlie White's constructed images from the October issue of Flash Art, where they look like scenes from a horror film, or the bottom image of a roadkill, supposedly taken from a movie, but all that exists is the image. One of my favorite pieces of work by Seymour Likely is this floor piece called "Never Marry a Railway Worker." It's made of blank pages of a book with a cover that's printed to resemble a sort of Gideon's Bible, and it's laid out on the floor like a car laundry floor piece. The reference to never marrying a railway worker also nods in the direction of Carl Andre, who once himself was a railway worker and in a bizarre court case was accused and acquitted of murdering his wife. But as you can imagine, the realm of the superfiction is ideal for entering the worlds of the conspiracy theory, bogus spiritual leaders, and dodgy philosophers. Sort of X-Files meets L. Ron Hubbard, that sort of thing. So it was no surprise when I discovered Rodney Glick doing a master's degree at the Centre for the Arts in Hobart, Tasmania. It was here that Rodney Glick and David Solomon invented Clusian philosophy, which outlines the 9 steps to moral and physical enlightenment, as outlined by Jose Palermo in the College of Disciples. Each year on a certain date, Klaus would reveal another step until the time came when he was due to travel to the United Nations and reveal the final, ultimate step of his wisdom. On the way to America, he disappeared and the world never knew his ultimate wisdom. Then several years later, a gardener working in a garden in Jerusalem came across Klaus wandering amongst the shrubs and flowers, and he passed on the last step to the gardener, which was start again, before he finally disappeared. Rodney Glick now runs an international artist program in a town in Western Australia, and he's created a number of other fictions, including getting a bookbinder to unbind copies of the Venice Biennale and Documenta catalogues and to insert his own work in it before rebinding it professionally. I was recently contacted by one of Rodney's old master's students, Evan O'Regan, and for her final year submission last November in Australia, she created a fictional cosmetics company called Babyface and launched it in Perth using a sort of typical media launch and models and press launch, etc. And this slide here is just to show that some people working in traditional painting modes are also creating fictions. This is Charles Green and Lyndell Brown, art partnership, who've been dubbed Olive because of the mix of brown and green in their names. They're based in Sydney, and they fictionalize the history of painting alongside the growth of the city in these quite beautifully painted images. Charles is also a correspondent from Australia for Art Forum magazine in New York. This is an artist I've just recently come across called Fred Wilson, who's made some remarkable installations that interrogate the place of the African American in American art history. This is obviously a comment on the one job African Americans most frequently find themselves doing in the white man's cultural mausoleum, that of the cleaner, with all the cleaning equipment on a plinth. But there's many more artists I could mention, like Martin Kippenberger, who I got to know well over several occasions before his untimely death, Douglas Gordon as well. But Martin Kippenberger embraced fiction in many of his projects, not least his entrances to subways around the world, which it was supposed to be a fictional metro system that girdled the earth, and he just created the entrances to these metro systems and the air cooling vents. So at Documenta in Kassel and at Münster in Germany, both in 1997, he had two of these entrances. There's another one in Canada and another one in the Mediterranean. At the same Documenta, the English artist Adam Page, who now lives in Dresden, built an executive box, which I suppose fictionalized corporate hospitality, but it also acted as a real meeting place for artists and dealers. And you probably all know the work of the Leeds 13, who I include here for their fictions. Supposedly, they took money from a university research office and squandered it on a holiday in the Mediterranean. In fact, they fabricated all the images on a rather chilly beach in Scarborough and returned the research money, possibly with interest, and had a rather bizarre week living in hiding in Leeds. And they've got a rather interesting website that you can visit. If you just go into a search engine and key in Leeds 13, you'll get into their website, which documents this project and the next one, the next project, which was their honours examination in the middle of this year, which caused outcry in the Times Higher Education Supplement, because rather than submit 13 discrete bodies of work for examination, they built a group installation made up of artworks by well-known artists from Henry Moore, Damien Hirst, Mark Quinn and Rodin, and posed the question to their examiners, I suppose, how do you examine a mixed honours exhibition like this when the artwork goes into the track lighting and the architecture of the building, and the way the work's displayed, and the juxtaposition of all the artworks. I was very interested in this because in a lot of the fictional art fairs I build in museums, I curate work in by local artists living in studios nearby whose work never gets seen in the major local museum, wherever it is in the world, and also work from the storage areas of museums. You know, go into any museum and look in the storage area, and there's great artworks that even the director and the curators have forgotten about, so I like to bring them out and curate them in to exhibitions. And as I'm traveling on this lecture tour, I'm going to lectures by other artists and making studio visits, and about 2 weeks ago I came across an old friend, Alexa Wright, who I hadn't seen for 10 years, who was having a show in Edinburgh at Portfolio Gallery. and she was giving a lecture about her work, and you may have seen some of it. This was one of her projects from a couple of years ago when she was looking at phantom limbs, and she was interviewing artists. And this image here shows this gentleman with what he could at that point feel of his phantom limb. Gradually that faded away too until it just became a thumb. And Alexa's next image was the thumb just coming out of the shoulder here. And I thought it was a very interesting project. I've also been trying to find group exhibitions of such work. I've only found 2 of them. One was For Real Now in 1990, which included a lot of the artists that I've described in this lecture. The next one was called Business at the Groningen Art Museum in Holland, which happened about 1994. And the catalogue for that was a giant pizza box, and you opened it up, and it was full of about 10 separate catalogues for groups like Seymour Likely, Res Ingold, Servaas, the Bank of Oklahoma, which recently deliberately went bankrupt as an artwork, and that's all catalogued in that exhibition. There's other things on the periphery of what I'm looking at, like the Blair Witch Project and the way that it was set up, the way that it used the internet to disseminate the information about it and get the hype going, and the way that the actors weren't totally let in on what the directors and the producers were doing with the project. But you can also go back 50, 60 years to Orson Welles and what he did with the War of the Worlds when it was broadcast live on radio without any introduction, and across America people thought that Martians had invaded the Earth, and there was a huge panic across America, and sadly several deaths resulted because of that. So I'm sort of documenting all of these things, and if any of you have any more information, I'd be glad to hear about it after the lecture. Also, intellectual impostures, the Alan Sokal scandal, I suppose, where he got a paper printed in a critical theoretical journal that was totally fictional, false, but riddled with jargon, and was published as if it was a real piece of critical theory. And this image is just going back to Juan Fontcuberto and Per Formaguera, and a quote from them, or from Juan Fontcuberto, where he says, "We believe the photographs of the footsteps on the moon, even though all the space expeditions could be an enormous montage. On the contrary," he continues, "we don't believe the photos of UFOs. We say they are faked and shrug them off." So it's that thing about reading images and ones that we can immediately say are false, others we're not sure about, and others that we're convinced by. And for about 5 or 6 years, my projects have been on a website which used to have one of these tortuously long addresses that I could never remember, from the University of Tasmania. But earlier this year, for handing over $70, a nice American company gave me a very short web address, which is quite simple. It's, if you remember New York Museum of Contemporary Ideas, it's just www.nymoci.com. So you just remember the New York Museum of Contemporary Ideas, and that gets you into the website. When you get into the home page, you see a museum elevator, and there's about 15 floors that you can visit. And I've got a different project on each floor, and I'm trying to get different sponsors to sponsor the different floors as a way of financing the different artworks. For example, down in the basement, the new bar is Plato's Cave, and the slogan on the beer coasters is "Linking drinking with thinking." And on the reverse of the beer coasters in gold, you've got the text from the Wolkenkratzer magazine about the museum, and that's sponsored by Montana Wines, who put $20,000 into the project when I had the show in Auckland in New Zealand, so I always give them a plug, and I had a rather nice glass of red Montana before coming here tonight. But Cameron Oil, on one of the other floors, I've got what I call the Encyclopedia of Superfictions, and I'm building in information about all the artists I've been talking about, plus my own work. Cameron Oil is there on the site, and I'm getting an increasing number of inquiries from real oil companies about Cameron Oil and from commodities brokers wanting to know more about it. So in the encyclopedia, I'm trying to bring in as many people as possible from around the world by listing as diverse a range of things as I can within the encyclopedia. This next image is me in my heroic amateur mode again. There's a border town in Australia on the border of New South Wales and Victoria called Albury-Wodonga. I'm talking about rival cities. That's a real rivalry. It's like one half of the tiny town is in one state, the other half's in the other, and there's an incredible rivalry, and even to the extent that fruit flies are allowed to go in one direction but not in the other. On fruit, you can take fruit across the bridge of the river one way, but you can't take fruit the other way because of the spread of fruit flies. But there's an art school there, and the art students asked me if I would come and open their honours year exhibition, but they wanted me to pretend I'd flown in from New York as the assistant press officer, and in those days I gave these lectures being introduced as the press officer from New York and maintained the fiction until about halfway through the lecture, but they said they wanted me to dress up in a heavy overcoat in 90-degree heat as if I'd just flown in from New York, and I got to the airport and there was a stretch limousine there waiting to meet me, and the whole art school had come out to the airport, and what I didn't know was they'd also told the local mayor and the local media and newspaper had also turned up, and so I had to bluff my way through the lecture, and that was just an example of a sort of side project. But some of the invented groups that I've worked with have taken on a life of their own, especially a group called Aloha, who's supposedly come from Brisbane in semi-tropical southern Queensland, and they make what Marcel Duchamp would call assisted ready-mades. In their case, each object has to pass through an airport departure lounge and be tagged with travel labels before being exhibited on the gallery wall. And they tell me that this ready-made, a child-sized tartan ironing board, is supposed to represent the oppression of women, children in Scotland as a nation in the one icon. This work dates from 9 years ago, but just last year I found life imitating art when an exhibition in northern Queensland took place actually on an airport carousel, and all the artworks travelled round in rotation on this carousel. But the group Aloha famously smuggled their little ironing board into Rennie Block's Sydney Biennale, which was photographed next to about 40 different artworks. You see it here against Richard Wentworth's sculpture. And there it is again next to the pillar beside Ian Hamilton Finlay's Adorno's hut. But Aloha also make works which comment on the crassness of museum merchandising, so they're not taking the piss out of artists, but out of the support structure of museum shops and a whole range of things that go alongside that. Herman Nietzsche is an artist for whom I've got enormous respect, but I took this photograph of him at the 1988 Sydney Biennale and slipped it inside a shower curtain from my local supermarket. And it's supposed to comment on the sort of things Andy Warhol shower curtains, Michelangelo's David boxer shorts, which you get, and Damien Hirst miniature sharks in miniature tanks. Things we're surrounded by only seconds after enjoying the company of the original artworks in the gallery. And so the museum shop for me is where the sublime meets the ridiculous. And of course I always visit them. Another area I'm becoming increasingly interested in is the media and editors more than presenters, and when editors of TV programs or newspapers get hold of a story, how they interpret it and how they want to twist it to their own end. So I find it difficult to watch this next little bit of video that's just coming on, but because I feature in it myself. But I'll show you about 4 minutes of that just to show you what happens when the media gets hold of your art project and they only want to talk about the hoax side of it, as in hoax artists visit city.
Art, it's sometimes hard to tell what's for real and what's a joke.
He leaves his mark in a very casual way. He's commenting on the works around him.
One man's art can be another's poison. And for the uninitiated, it appears almost anything goes. But would you believe that a bunch of artists could win a $100,000 prize for a blood-soaked shower curtain? Well, apparently an Australian group called Aloha did just that. So we decided to track down them and their gruesome masterpiece. Our only lead, a glowing write-up in an international art magazine. Surely one of the largest art galleries in the country would know something about Aloha and their work. Have you ever seen this work before,
No.
or do you know anything about it?
No.
Never heard of Aloha?
I've never heard of Aloha.
Well, it seems to have won a $100,000
Well,
prize.
all grist to his curtain if he's won $100,000. I have to tell you that I wouldn't give you tuppence for it, let alone $100,000.
Our suspicions were further aroused when no one else knew anything about Aloha either. Not the gurus of the contemporary art world.
Yeah, I don't know about that particular group, no.
Nor the young guns of the Sydney art scene. Have you ever heard of this group called Aloha?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't, no.
Any of you know a bit about modern art, don't you?
I know quite a lot about modern art, but never...
You've never seen the shower
actually-
curtains?
Shower curtain, no.
Aloha began to look like frauds, involved in a gigantic con trick or an elaborate hoax. But one man claimed to know the truth.
And Aloha doesn't exist.
The group that did it don't exist?
No. They supposedly were a group based in Brisbane, but they're a fictitious group.
Who's behind this hoax?
Well, he's rather an elusive character, and you'll have to go to Hobart to find that out.
Fortunately, Hobart's a small place, so it wasn't hard to track down our man. We discovered his name is Peter Hill, seemingly an innocent art lecturer at the University of Tasmania. Initially, attempts to contact him proved fruitless, until we gave chase. Mr. Hill, can you tell us who Aloha are?
No comment.
No, this group Aloha, are you responsible for them in any sense? What sort of... Eventually, Peter Hill agreed to come clean at an exclusive interview in his office.
Are you responsible for this?
Yes, I am. My name's Peter Hill. I teach here at the Centre for the Arts in Hobart, and it's part of a much bigger project, almost like a hoax, the Museum of Contemporary Ideas.
Okay, well, I'll thankfully stop it there. I hate watching that, but I include it because that was about take 24 up in my office, and they were determined to get me to use the word hoax, and I was determined not to use it, and the producer was saying, well, they won't make the program and they won't screen it unless it's presented only as a hoax without any other aspect to it or side to it. And as you see, eventually I cracked and said almost like a hoax, and at that point they got what they wanted and they unplugged their lights and their TV and the camera and they were off. So since then I've become increasingly interested in how editors, especially of TV programs, edit programs, and you get all these sound bites of 2 or 3 minutes or 30 seconds. And what I'd quite like to do in the future is unedit a TV program, so sort of go through it with a video and rebuild it the way that it was actually shot, rather than the way that we as consumers end up getting it. Anyway, the next 6 slides are just very quickly autobiographical. For a short while in the early 1970s, I worked as a lighthouse keeper off the west coast of Scotland on 3 different lighthouses, Highsker, Ailsa Craig and Plada, which is just off the island of Arran. And that was one of the best years of my life, which was followed about 18 months later. This was me as a young art student in those days, quickly go over that. This was followed about 18 months later by one of the worst periods when I was almost blown up in the Guildford pub bombings. I'd been about to go in about half an hour before the pub blew up, and it must be close to 25 years ago this month that happened. And I mention all these things now because they come together in my current project, The Art Fair Murders, that I'm writing. But after that, I went on to publish and edit Alba magazine from Scotland. And from there, I moved down to Australia, and I just put this slide in to give you an idea of the scale of it, more or less going from Finland down to Egypt and Dublin across to Turkey. And spent the last 9 or so years at the Centre for the Arts in Hobart, which is a fantastic art school down on the waterfront. And during my time there, I travelled back about once a year to Europe, stopping at places like Bangkok on the way out and the way back in at different Pacific islands. Also documenting different fictions, such as this is here in Hawaii, where it's like a theme park where all the people here are dressed up like so-called Hawaiian natives, but they're actually university students at the Mormon University on the island who pay their way through university by fictionalizing or bastardizing their own culture. Giant fiberglass statues in the background and man-made waterfalls and rivers and lakes. So I'm kind of documenting these cultural tourism events, if you like, as superfictions. The next few slides just look at some of the theoretical background, which comes, if from anywhere at all, from the philosophy of science, people like Paul Feyerabend, Thomas Kuhn, and Karl Popper. Especially Popper's notion that you could cite white swans any number of times, and you'd never be able to say that all swans are white, whereas the single sighting of a black swan does allow you to say not all swans are white. So it's that, what Popper called sophisticated methodological falsificationism, which lies at the opposite end from the more popular idea of the hoax, at the other extreme of what I'm, I suppose, looking at. And from Thomas Kuhn, I suppose, we get the idea of the paradigm change, that terrible term that used to be very useful but now is used in just about every way possible, misused in just about every way possible. I think change of fashion probably in most cases works just as well. But if you really want to look into the term paradigm change, Margaret Masterman, the computer scientist, is the person to go to. She's located 23 quite separate ways that Thomas Kuhn uses the term paradigm change in the structure of scientific revolutions. But I tend to use it through looking at the covers of art magazines, and we see the paradigm change from neo-expressionism through to neo-geo, or new geometric abstraction, through to art in the body, art in the abject. These changes happening at sort of 5-yearly intervals. I don't think they're happening any quicker post-war than they did, say, pre-First World War. I think from 1900 to 1918, there was as many paradigm changes as there have been from 1980 to 2000. Okay, so I'll just finish off by looking at a few of the current projects very briefly that are on my website. I've got the International Portrait Gallery, where I've been under the remit of Made in Palestine, photographing different artists around the world. This is Marina Abramovic at the Venice Biennale 2 years ago. Martin Kippenberger working at the Alba desk at the Los Angeles Art Fair. And you can access all these on the website. And when I have exhibitions, some of them are blown up into large cibachromes. Dennis Hopper at his exhibition in Kassel in Germany, again in '97. And then on another floor in the museum, I'm going to build a museum of signage. And for about 25 years, I've been photographing signage around the world, which came out of a project I was doing about angels. And I took this photograph of the angel Islington in about 1975, juxtaposed against a Monopoly card of the angel Islington. And this was the last one taken about a month ago in my home city of Geelong in Australia, when the Australian troops were just going into East Timor. And as well as using signage, I'm interested in using language and translation as artwork. So a lot of the material I produce is in French, German, and English, but I want to expand that in future into other languages. And the Art Fair Murders is about, the basic idea for it is that there's 12 chapters in the novel. There's 12 art fairs around the world, 12 murders occur, and there's 12 months of the year, so it's that kind of architectural structure to the novel which goes alongside an installation that I'm building, and I want them not to be illustrations of each other, but to work together and to grow together. Contemporary art fairs, as I'm sure you know, there's a major one every month of the year. If it's January, it's Miami. February, it's Arco in Madrid. March might be Frankfurt, through to Los Angeles in December. And it's totally about money. People rent spaces for £10,000 for a week, put up artworks and sell the artworks. And I'm speculating on what would happen if there was a serial killer in the art world going from one art fair to the other, committing a murder at each event. And I wanted to take a deliberate cliche from the art world and from the world of literary fiction. So I took the serial killer from literary fiction, and I took the use and the overuse of the mannequin from the art world. This was back about 95. And I build these installations. The umbrella tables are a bit like visual oxymorons again, because they're inside buildings where it hopefully won't be raining. And I use signage a bit like metonyms, where you can put the name on a crate, indicating artists who may be there or who may not, but just through the name on the crate. And I also like to build press offices with inside museums, so that you go into a museum normally and it's pristine clean and everything's laid out and curated, and then you visit the press office or where the technicians work, and it's all clutter and jumble, and I like to bring that out into the actual gallery space itself. And I modeled this one on the actual technician's coffee area and the press office in the Auckland City Gallery. And what I did, I started off by writing the sort of blurb that you get on the back of an airport novel describing the Art Fair Murders, the sort of thing that the novelist himself or herself never writes, but someone in the marketing department does. So that was my template, if you like, for the novel. Then I placed advertisements in magazines like the London Review of Books, and said that I was writing this novel and calling for expressions of interest from agents and from publishers, and I got zero response to that advert in the London Review of Books. Then I put the same ad in, but I just added that line saying there'd be an internet auction from $500,000, and that went in the following month, and I got a huge response from publishers and agents all over the world. Rome, Italy, New York, London. So just by adding that taste of money to the advert, it changed the whole thing. I was also critiquing the world of literary fiction at that time, when Martin Amis had been writing The Information, and it had been auctioned for £500,000, and there was a great fuss about that, whereas when Nicholas Evans wrote The Horse Whisperers and it was auctioned for $3 million, there was no fuss at all, because that was seen to be about entertainment and not about literary fiction. So all of that became part of my critique of the literary world. And on the website, if you go into the floor that says The Art Fair Murders and click on that, you then get 4 options, the bottom one of which is the making of the Art Fair Murders. And if you then click on that, you go through all the documentation on all the faxes from different agents and publishers. So I'm trying to, on the web, build up the whole project and how it's progressing. And supposedly the novel's been written by an ex-Goldsmiths graduate who's originally from Scotland and who used to work as an art transporter, and he's now lost his job and he's working as a taxi driver in Aberdeen in Scotland. So in the novel, I'm actually producing the business card for his taxi and creating all the visual side of the novel as well as just the book itself. And he uses what he calls art transporter rhyming slang. So George Brack for back, Fra Filippo Lippi for hippie, Damien Hirst for first, as in first class honours. And there's a whole range of different rhyming slangs that feature throughout the book. And this is my final slide. At the right-hand side, you can see during the installations of the art fair murders, there's always a murder recreated using a mannequin, reflecting on the use of the mannequin in the art in the 1990s. And Jacko is supposedly writing the novel in 1999, but looking back at 1989 and the great year of revolutions, Tiananmen Square, the Berlin Wall coming down, also the year the Guildford Four were released from prison, and all of that is feeding into the next lecture which I'm preparing, which will just be on the art fair murders themselves. And I don't know if we've got time for the last bit of video. Yeah, there's about 4 minutes of video that I'll maybe just finish off with, which looks back at 1989 and the events of that year, and all of those events are covered in different chapters of the art fair murders. I should say that I gave myself a hard task. When each murder happens, the serial killer supposedly leaves a postcard relating to the death beside the body. So the first murder is in Miami, and someone's electrocuted on a hand dryer in a toilet at the art fair when they press the metal button, and the killer leaves an Andy Warhol electric chair postcard next to the body. So I've set myself a great problem trying to find 12 different murders that have different postcards that can be left beside the body. And the final one, though, is a postcard of Guernica, and it's Los Angeles, chapter 12. And the idea is that somewhere a bomb is being planted.
Picasso's deadline was the 4th of June, but by the end of April, he had not started work on the commission. On the 26th of April, the German Air Force, whose Condor Legion was supporting Franco, bombed and machine-gunned Guernica, the most ancient town of the Basques and the centre of their cultural traditions. The town, without defences or obvious military importance, was almost completely destroyed. 2 days later, in L'Humanité, the paper of the French left, Picasso would have seen this report. Even in the generally pro-Franco paper of the political right, Le Figaro, a picture of the destruction appeared on April the 30th. The Spanish Civil War forced many intellectuals in Western Europe, and particularly in France, to take sides on the issue of fascism versus democracy, or for some, fascism versus communism. For Picasso, whose hedonistic lifestyle in the 1920s and 1930s reflected his detachment from political or public events, the acceptance of the commission meant that the time of not taking sides was past. For his French friends, the threat was that if Spain followed the road of Germany and Italy, France would be surrounded by fascist dictatorships. Picasso could no longer ignore the situation in Spain. There's been rumours that he was pro-Franco, but in May 1937 he made the following statement, made public 2 months later. The Spanish struggle is the fight of reaction against the people, against freedom. My whole life as an artist has been nothing more than a continuous struggle against reaction and the death of art.
Continues, and it uses rock music.
Pouring like an avalanche coming down the mountain.
I don't mind the sun sometimes, the images it shows. I can taste you on my lips and smell
caused by just one explosion. One explosion.
Dakle, sve ovo je uzrokovano samo jednom eksplozijom.
Yes, it has.
Yeah.
So all this was caused by just one explosion.
14 years after their imprisonment for a crime of which they were innocent, the Guildford Four were finally set free. They'd been convicted on the basis of confessions which they later retracted.
There has been a serious miscarriage of justice which has resulted in wrongful imprisonment for many years. Even though that wrongful conviction has now been righted as a result of police investigations and the decision of the Court of Appeal, we must all, I believe, feel anxiety, regret, and deep concern at what has occurred.
I've been in prison 15 years for something I didn't do, for something I didn't know anything about. Totally innocent man. I watched my father die in a British prison for something he didn't do. 15 years for something I didn't do, for something I didn't know anything about. Totally innocent man. I watched my father die in a British prison for something he didn't do.
There has been a serious miscarriage of justice which has resulted in wrongful imprisonment for many years. Even though that wrongful conviction has now been righted as a result of police investigations and the decision of the Court of Appeal, we must all, I believe, feel anxiety, regret, and deep concern at what has occurred.
I've been in prison 15 years for something I didn't do, for something I didn't know anything about. Totally innocent man. I watched my father die in a British prison for something he didn't do.
You never know just how to look through other people's eyes.
Pursuit and fiery auto crashes. Some will die in hot pursuit while sifting through my ashes. Some will fall in love with life and drink it from a fountain that is pouring like an avalanche coming down the mountain.
I don't mind the sun sometimes, the images it shows. I could taste you on my lips and smell you in my clothes. Cinnamon and sugary and softly spoken lies. You never know just how you look through other people's eyes.
Another monkey took a knife while arguing in traffic. Flipper died.
On the 33rd anniversary of the day that the Soviet army crushed their uprising, the Hungarians celebrated the promise of free elections and parliamentary democracy. And this time, as the spirit of freedom began to hurtle across the Eastern Bloc, the Russians seemed entirely relaxed.
The new doctrine is in its place, which is Frank Sinatra doctrine. Frank Sinatra has a very popular song, I Had It My Way. So Hungary, Poland, any other country has it its own way. They decide which road to take. It's their business.
So, in the most vital and loyal satellite of all, scores of thousands of people braved the wrath of the regime in a sudden, unexpected and unprecedented challenge.
We're calling for free election and for democracy, and we don't want to have a dictatorship.
The troops were not sent in, despite Erich Honecker, who thought he could ignore the new Kremlin and survive. Within days, however, there was a new man in charge, Egon Krenz.
sort of, at this stage, it's still very much a work in progress, and just those last 10, 20 minutes are what I'm working on at the moment, and trying to get copyright releases for different bits of video, etc. And I'll be working on that, I suppose, throughout a lot of next year. So thank you for coming, and yeah.
I suppose if there are any burning questions, we could take them now very quickly. We've run on a little bit, but I guess we could take some questions if there are some as well.
Yes, yeah, they're got a bag of pens down here, if any. Yeah, well, I suppose that's what the project's about, isn't it? Yeah. Although I always try and answer any questions honestly, if you can believe that. Yeah, I think that's probably the case, or more with the Art Fair Murders. I think there's more of the literary world that I'm going into as an amateur that'll probably come out in the book. But I think a lot of the artists I'm looking at, they either have closed worlds or open worlds. In terms of Res Ingold is very much about airlines and nothing else, whereas Seymour Likely and Rodney Glick are going off in all sorts of directions, and sometimes it's about the art world and sometimes it's about something else. Whereas in my own work, it tends to be mostly about the art world. Yep. Right, good. Well, yeah, thanks again. Thanks for